screen, it records. And if I hit supposed to, if you don't wish to be recorded, please do turn off your video if you don't want to be on the screen during the recording. But we are now recording, so yay, hooray for that. The first thing I want to do absolutely is thank Kafi Allah, who is the Adult and Teen Program Coordinator here at the library, for making all this possible. She is in the background today. She has 2 events to work with, so she may be around if we need her. It may be a few minutes before we can reach her. I have the meeting up on 2 computers, so in theory, if something goes wrong with one of them, I can just switch to the next computer. So hopefully this will go really smoothly. You know, we are on the internet, so things do happen. Things like the picture hanging up for a moment, or you know, things going funky. Apparently you're popping in without having to sign in or be admitted. So if you fall out, please just come right back in. And if I drop off, I will try and get back in or back on the other computer as quickly as possible. So please just hang in there. We've had technical issues before, so it's life on the internet. On the other hand, if we weren't on the internet, we wouldn't all be together today. There would be like, I think 5 of us here that I recognize as locals, 5 or 6 people. So welcome to everyone. Because we have such a large group, I am going to ask you to keep yourselves muted, please. Please check and see that you're muted, and make sure that, because it keeps background noise from your house coming in. And just know we're going to work for a while and then take a break, and I'm going to work on as much of this as I can. The handout is really 3/4 of the program. It has most of the information I wanted to share. What I'm going to do today is talk about the advantages of these various techniques, why we might choose one, what its options offer. And I want to quote 2 people, always Thomas Edison, who said, "There are no rules here. We're trying to create something." And of course, he invented the light bulb and all sorts of wonderful things. So if you hear me say something that sounds like a rule, I misspoke. Everything in poetry, I have to say, is a possibility. It's something to try on. And these techniques are probably things, you know, once you learn something and it's in your head, it comes to you when you're writing, and it may be there and present when you're doing that first draft. But a lot of these techniques are really going to be most available, sorry, video weirdness again, most available to you in revision. So don't worry if all this doesn't happen the next time you sit down, you don't get a brilliant title and fabulous openings. They'll come to you. And you can always work with the handout. Well, Ellen Bass, let me see if there's anything else I needed to tell you. If you would now save the chat for the break, unless you're having a technical problem. In workshops I've been in the past, people have said it gets distracting while, you know, popping up. And so if you would just save it for the break. So Ellen Bass says the poet's first job is to be interesting. And so that's what all this is about, is how to write interesting titles, how to write interesting beginnings. So I'm going to jump right in, and you'll see me looking off to the side because I have a lot of notes. I try to remember to look at the little camera, and then it looks like I'm speaking to you. But what it looks like to me is I'm ignoring all of you because you're down here. So if you see my eyes looking down, I'm probably looking at your faces and thinking I'm talking to you. All this internet presentation Zoom stuff is still tricky to me. So I'm going to go through these options and fairly quickly. And if you do have questions, please type those in the chat as we go. And I'll try to look at them during the break, and we'll try and talk about them either when we come back from the break or at the end. We may not have a lot of time to do everything. I used to teach 3-hour workshops, but people say that's a lot on Zoom. So we're going to try and stick to 2 hours. We may run over, so the questions may happen after 2 p.m. and or after 3:30. And if you need to go at the end of the class, at the end of 2 hours, please do. So titles. Titles can deliver information that then isn't needed in the poem. One of the first places I look at titles, partly because I write a lot of narrative poetry, One of the first ways I look at titles as the four W's of journalism: who, what, when, and where. Can I get that information up in the title, ground my readers, and then not need all of that in the poem itself? So there's lots of titles I listed here, and names some of their work I think they're doing. So that's a good list you can look at. I did want to talk about a couple of them. Bakersfield, 1969, Dorian Locks. It names a specific place. And when a title names a specific place, I kind of hope to see something about the place in the poem. You don't absolutely have to, but it's sort of, we're more grounded if we feel the place in some way or see it in some way. So in Bakersfield, 1969, what she gives us is the intense heat, which I didn't know about Bakersfield, so now I do. In 1969, of course, there's some things in there about 1969 as well. That doesn't always happen, but if you can share something of a place and time, that's good. That makes it a more interesting title. Tony Hogan's Lucky. It's one word, kind of vague. On the one hand, it doesn't tell us much, and on the other hand, the world is wide open for this poet, for where he wants to go with it. And we're going to talk about one-word titles in a little bit. Fatima Asghar, Pluto shits on the universe. She gives us who, what, and where. That's a lot of information. That kind of titillation in a title, it's going to catch people's eye. It's interesting. I think I put it at the bottom of this list. Ask yourself, which is more interesting? Your poem could be called In the Forest, or it could be Dancing Naked Under the Oaks, if that's what's going on in the poem. Which of those titles are you going to read first? If you're scanning a table of contents, be honest. Which are you going to read, right? I mean, we're all going to read Dancing Naked Under the Oaks. So the more interesting your title is, the more likely that poem is to be read. It's just a reality if we're picking and choosing. It just is. If we're scanning a journal or if we're reading a book, it just is a great way to think of it. Titles do not have to be grounded in reality. Back when I was younger and could still fly, that's a great title. It's still a what, who, where, or who, when, what kind of title. Back when I was younger, when I is the who, and I could fly. That's amazing title. It gives us a lot to look at. I promise I'm more bewildered than the bats. Well, that's just funny. The first job of a title might be to be interesting, and that's funny. So that's a great title. And it just gives us interesting information to go from. So since poetry is life distilled, remember our job is to give readers a large experience in a small space. And I am speaking as if everyone here wants readers. That may not be true of you. And then you're writing for yourself. Make it interesting for yourself, But we're trying to large experience, small space, life distilled. So using our title in an interesting way not only hooks readers, it's a really effective use of our real estate. We don't have a lot of real estate in poetry, so it's a really good use. Titles can raise questions in readers' minds that we want to see resolved. So I'm working through your handout. I'm just adding information to your handout. I hope you have it available in some way. They can raise questions in readers' minds that we want to see resolved.
Can you just tell us where you're reading from on the sheets, if at all? Because I can't find the titles you're talking about.
Oh, I'm on number 3.
Okay, just keep us posted because I like to follow it. Thank you.
Sure, yes, I can't see who's speaking, but sure, yes. Titles raise questions in readers' minds that we want to see resolved. Remember, it's not necessarily the poem's job to resolve every question, but title questions are a lure to us. Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays. What about those winter Sundays? This sort of thing happens all the time. Maggie Smith, what happens all the time? Mostly Mick Jagger. Why mostly? What does mostly have to do with Mick Jagger? So if we can be interesting and raise a question. Oh, somebody said, thank you for the handouts. You're so welcome. You're so welcome. It was definitely a labor of love. I had a great time this month. I didn't do anything else poetry-wise, but I had a fabulous time on this. So thank you. Yeah, so can you say something that's gonna just hook people's curiosity? You know, we're curious creatures. So that's a really great way to present your poem. Number 4, they can be intriguing without giving us a clear idea what the poem's about. This is poetry. This is not journalism. We can use the 4 W's of journalism in our work, but this is not journalism. We do not have to stick to the facts. We can be as funny or fascinating or weird or intriguing or whatever that we want to be. So when I see a title like Patty M. Rogers' Holy Heathen Rhapsody, I think, why? Why are holy and heathen stuck together? And why with Rhapsody? I want to see what's going on. Or Hammond B3 organ cistern. I know what a Hammond B3 is, but what's it got to do with a cistern? Why is a musical instrument connected with a cistern? Or You Did Not Sell, the bluing with these little dashes. Where is Sharon Olds going there? So a title that just doesn't explain itself, but catches our eye is still a really, really, really strong title. Titles that number 5 that step out of the unexpected, they surprise us. Not only does that create interest for readers, it can be more interesting for the writer. You know, I used to write work. I was a freelance garden writer, and I gave up titling my articles to anybody because nobody ever used my titles. So I would just, if I wrote about echinaceas, I'd just say echinaceas. So I really had to teach myself to think about what made an interesting title, you know, because it wasn't a skill I had at all. So saying things that create interest for the readers are also going to be more interesting for the writer. It's one more way to spend time with your poem and play with it. And, you know, if you think of what someone once said of poems, that they're games we make hard for fun. So if you think of it like that, when you're stuck for a title, you know, it's a game. You made it hard for fun. Have fun with it. So being interesting, again, is a great way to have fun with it yourself. So how to cook a wolf, is that going to be real or, you know, concrete image or metaphorical? I mean, nobody really cooks a wolf, right? But it's curious, it's unexpected. I want to see what's going on. Number 6, titles can contain a story that then isn't told in full or told at all in the poem. So that allows us, again, to condense, to use our real estate very effectively. Reginald Dwayne Betts has a brilliant poem called When I Think of Tamir Rice While Driving. You know, if you're in the US, you probably at least know the story of Tamir Rice being shot by a Chicago policeman. He was 12. So we don't need to have that story necessarily in the poem in order to be with the writer. So if you're writing about something that's well known, could be history, it could be science. If it's, you know, if it's obscure, you may need to explain. So if you want us with you, but if it's public knowledge, if it's in the water supply, you could put it in the title and then have all the rest of your poem to work out the things you want to think about and say. So if I could see a quick show of hands, how is this pace? Am I talking too fast? It's good. Everybody's good.
I'm sorry.
I didn't. Yeah, there goes the video again.
You say number 5, but that's number 4 on my sheet. They can surprise or confound. Do I have the wrong sheet? I like to follow it because then I get to see the author of the poem and I can look it up later. So I would like reference to the sheet, and I wonder why ours is different. All along, your numbers have been different.
Oh, it may be that I did some editing and didn't realize I did. So where are you?
Number
What
4
number
on my sheet. Number 4 is can surprise or confound.
We're just one number off.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, but again, referring to the specific category and number will help me, because then I can see who wrote those poems, so I can look them up later. Thank you.
So if I say number 7, titles can riff on or give a nod to something known in the culture. Are you on number 6?
Yes, ours is 6.
Okay, so let's just all know we're one different. If I forget to say it that way, we're just one different. So, excuse me. So again, something known in the culture. I was just talking about Tamir Rice. My video is really wonky. Talking about Tamir Rice, but there are other references. Blueberries for Cal by Brenda Shaughnessy. That's a great poem about her son. And she's riffing on the title of an old children's book called Blueberries for Sal, which was published, I think, in the 1940s and was still very popular by the 80s, at least, when my nieces were coming along. So it's out there in the culture. The thing is, not everyone's going to get that reference, but it doesn't matter. When you read the poem, it makes no difference. So you can use titles that way and riff on something that's known to you and yours. It might be your generation, it might be your part of the country. If it's going to hurt the poem for people in other places to not know what you're talking about, then you might want to explain. If it makes no difference, then it's just a bonus for people who get it. So Blueberries for Cal is like that. Patrick Ramsey's I'd Rather Be Influenced refers to internet influencers. My video just keeps hybridizing my head with Ruth's, and then it spazzes back and forth. So that's why I keep switching off. I'd Rather Be Influenced refers to internet influencers. He doesn't ever mention them in the poem. He just talks about things he'd like to be influenced to do or choose, like eat more cantaloupe, write more letters, that sort of thing. But the juxtaposition is there strictly in the title. It's beautiful work. It's really subtle. It's subtle and brilliant. So that's another choice you can make with titles. Okay, I think your number 7 is titles can convey an atmosphere or mood, like humor or darkness, cheer, mystery, dread, delight. That gets people interested. If you're grieving and someone mentions grief in their title, that's going to draw you probably. If you're happy and celebrating and you see something that refers to delight, well, there you are. You probably want to be in that poem. So it's just a way to start answering the question in readers' minds of where is this poem going to take me? So a title like Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude. A title of Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude is a video. Just such a brilliant title by Ross Gay. And then you juxtapose it with, say, Field of Skulls. You can see that you get a very different feeling. So that's one thing we can start to do with our titles, is give people a feel for the poem, just a feel for how this is going to go. That similarly, number 8 on your page, they can convey an emotion like happiness or sadness or grief. They might say it right out, like Jane Kenyon's Happiness, or they might be a little, more expansive, Catherine Carter's River of Anguish. Keep in mind, we aren't trapped in that emotion. It's a starting point. And it's also possible that the poem not end up being what the title says it is. You have that option too, and we're going to talk about that in just a little bit. All day I have been pining for the past. Rebecca Baggett, that's my brilliant sister, by the way. And I love that title. That word pining is so useful there. It's so meaningful. It's just a great word. And it echoes, of course, past. Pining and past, those sounds work well together. We haven't really talked about sound in our titles, but it's a good place to start using that tool. And we will talk about music in titles when we get a little further along. God, I feel like I'm moving fast because I only have 2 hours, but it looks like I may have, when I rehearsed this first part, it took me almost an hour just to do titles. So now I feel like I'm saying it faster and I may have a little more time than I realize. So if you're starting to have a question, I'll try and keep an eye on the chat there if you're starting to have a question. Titles can be honest, fearless, sexy, or sassy. Openness and vulnerability is very attractive. It's appealing. It connects to us right away. So if your title is open and honest and vulnerable, people connect. They start immediately connecting it to their own experiences. So that's a really good use for a title, is to catch people in that way. Emmett Till's name still catches in my throat, Marilyn Nelson. Yeah, yeah. And then you kind of go, yeah, when I hear his name too, yeah. Woman, 41, with a history of Alzheimer's on both sides of her family. You kind of start to feel something right away for her, you know, that, oh my gosh, that's going to be a heavy thing, you know. So we start to relate right away. Why the marriage failed. A lot of people have a poem in them about why the marriage failed, or maybe poems in them about why the marriage failed. So definitely, and that's so vulnerable just to say, oh, I'm just going to say it right out. This is what happened and this is why. Or January Gill O'Neill's First Sex After Divorce. That's a pretty open and honest title, right? Right? How many of you feel comfortable? Maybe just raise your hand. How many of you feel comfortable being vulnerable in your titles? Or does it feel like too soon? Like maybe the body of the poem? Yeah. Sometimes for people, the body of the poem is the place where they get open to things, but can't actually do that as comfortably in the title. Let me ask a question. Is my video spazzing for you guys when it spazzes? Yes. Why me? Nobody else is doing that today. I have no idea why. I have no idea. The very open and honest and vulnerable. Oh, thank you. Not disruptive. Well, I keep switching it off. Thank you. The very open and honest and vulnerable Sharon Olds will tell us almost anything. She has a poem in her new book, Ballads, called Ms. Turbation. Yeah, she talks about sex. She has an entire book called Stag's Leap about her husband leaving her. And my internet connection, that's entirely possible. Yes, if I log out and come back in, yes, thank you. I'll try that if it keeps being a problem. Sharon Olds has a very open and honest book called Stag's Leap. Her husband left her and she wrote an entire book about it, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. So if you want to see what open and honest and vulnerable looks like, that's a good book to check out. Down at the bottom of this category is a title in brackets, I Aborted 2 Daughters, Diane Seuss. Diane's, her book is all sonnets. Oh, geez, this busyness. Her book is all sonnets, and technically sonnets are untitled, and hers are untitled. So what she does is, in the table of contents, they use the first line of the poem as the title. And that's how sonnets are usually listed in books. So if you're writing sonnets, or if you're choosing for some reason to not title your poems, that is how they would be listed in publications. That's book is fascinating. Frank Sonnets. It's won the Pulitzer, it won the National Book Award, it won 2 or 3 other major awards. So if you're interested in that sort of writing, you know, seeing what that kind of writing could be like, you should check it out. Our next category, titles can issue an instruction or command. We're going to just stop the video for a moment and just see if it will chill. Titles can issue an instruction or command. Sometimes these are used for instructional poems, but not always. It begins a conversation with the reader. If you say, relax, you know, right away, it's like we've just been given this little command. And I want to make a correction under this category. So it's number 10 in your handout. W.S. Merwin's poem is not titled Listen, so that shouldn't be here. The poem is actually titled Thanks, and I just remembered it backwards. It's titled Thanks, and the first word is on a line all by itself, listen. So he gives us an instruction, but it's in the first line and not in the title. So we have relax. We have Tyree Day's Don't Say Love, Just Signal, which is an interesting title. It's like, what are we going with this? What is this going to mean? And Adam Zagajusti's Try to Praise the Mutilated World. That's a heck of a title, isn't it? Praising a mutilated thing. It's going to be a fascinating poem. We just have to get there. The other poem, the title that should not be in this category, I think I did this one at the end of the day somehow. How to Write a Love Letter to Your Brother. That's really, that sort of instruction is different from the kind of command I'm thinking of, like relax or try to praise the mutilated. But we will talk about instructional poems openings when we get a little further along. So a title can reflect the intention of the poem. Sincerity can be appealing. We're told what we're getting. And, you know, in this poem, Ingratitude by Abigail Carroll, it's gratitude for the letter H. It's a fascinating poem. Definitely look it up. She uses words like hush and holy, and there's oak trees in this poem. It's just a gorgeous poem. She wrote an entire poem in gratitude to a letter of the alphabet, but we don't know that in the title. We just know it's going to be a poem about gratitude, or we think it's going to be a poem about gratitude. She might surprise us, but in this case, it does reflect the intention of the poem. And Ross Gay's A Poem in Which I Try to Express My Glee at the Music My Friend Has Given Me. Oh, that's such a beautiful and long title, and it's a gorgeous poem. And he tells us he's going to try to express his glee. So that's a title reflecting the intention of the poem. Titles can also mislead. They can point in a direction away from where the poem goes, or even opposite of where the poem goes. It creates a certain tension, and we'll talk more about it when we get to talk about beginnings. But here are a couple that showed up. What Did I Love? Ellen Bass, the Hammond B3 organ sister, and we'll talk about later. But here's an example from one of my poems. A love poem for my muse. That's the title. The first line is, why are you such a tight-lipped she-hag anyway? I was writing, I didn't write the title. I think that one I did write the title first. And then that just popped out of my mouth. And I thought, oh, I'm going to go with this. So the whole poem is about this tight-lipped she-hag. But don't leave me, you know, you're my muse, so don't leave me. So titles can be shocking or provocative or transgressive of social boundaries. They can be impolite. They can talk about things we don't talk about. What is the advantage of that? Well, the advantage is that it's not your job as a writer to be polite and mind, you know, social strictures. That's not your job. Your job is to say what needs to be said. Either you need to say it or the world needs to hear it. Somehow it needs to be said. So you might write a poem like Crazy Motherfucker Weather, you know, Tony Hoagland, and you can use profanity in a title. You might, like Sharon Olds, who has no discretion whatsoever, write an ode to the tampon. That's up to you. That's up to you. I long to hold the poetry editor's penis in my hand. Francesca Bell, hilarious poem. Hilarious poem. And what she's really doing in this poem, look it up, it's on the internet, she's using cliches from rejection letters to write the poem. So she's, yeah. And don't we all really kind of want to do that some days? It's kind of a good one to keep around if you're getting rejections. So what I want to say about these poems, titles and opening lines, is that all of this material, almost all of these poems are on the internet. If they're not, they're in the writer's books, and usually, often I'm using one of their newer books. I use 2 journals of Tar River Poetry from fall of 2022 and Spillway number 29. So if you want to go looking things up and you can't find them on the internet, go to their books or go to either of those journals, Spillway number 29 or Tar River Poetry fall 2022. And we'll try this video again. See if we can get it to work. I have even less reliable internet out in the country. That's why I'm at the library to teach today. I've waited years to get to teach again when COVID started. Maya, you should have gotten a handout. And if you didn't get it, there's a link to it on the website where you registered. So all these titles should be, all the poem titles should be in that link. Oh, the 2 I just mentioned are Tar River Poetry, fall 22, and Spillway number 29. So titles can add weight, gravitas, an additional layer of complexity. Let's look at The Estate of Solemnity, Patty Ann Rogers. In her poem, she really beautifully describes things that are solemn, like Spanish moss and stalagmites and the moon and rocky crags, that sort of thing. Thank you, Sarah. And she could have just called the poem Solemnity, but she didn't. She said The Estate of Solemnity. This is someone, Patty Ann Rogers, you could read her books just to be reading the titles. She really puts a lot of effort into her titles. So this added word is just a technique of saying more. So you get the title that you have, and then you look at it and say, is there more to be said? Can I add to this? Can I expound on this? So that's what she does. And a brief for the defense, Jack Gilbert. He could have called this a defense of delight, but he felt like this needed a legal defense, which implies he thinks his view will be prosecuted. And it's one of the poems we're going to look at in the second half of this workshop on turns and endings, which will be at the end of February. And that's one of the poems we'll look at and in its entirety. So today we're only seeing titles and beginnings. Next time we'll see whole poems. So titles can take advantage of the fact that as humans, we're curious, even nosy about one another. And I can prove this, do you read supermarket tabloid headlines if you're stuck in line? Do you ever watch interviews with famous people? Do you ever eavesdrop on someone else's conversation? We're nosy. So if you give somebody something to be curious about, they're going to be interested in your poem. So lies I told my third child. What lies and why? I especially like the third child part. Why specifically this child? Why did this child get singled out for this treatment? Or won't you celebrate with me? Lucille Clifton's excellent poem. What is she celebrating? Or what I believe, Kimberly Blazer. I want to see what she believes because I examine my beliefs all the time, and I'd like to know how other people organize themselves in the world. So that would be an interesting poem to me. Sometimes a title leads straight into the poem. In other words, the title is the first line of the poem. And Jean Wagner's here. My mother was like the bees because she needed a lavish taste on her tongue. Is that the best choice? Is leading directly into your poem, using your first line as your title, is that your best choice? Or is it a last resort because nothing else is coming to mind? Either of those could be reasonable choices as far as I'm concerned. If nothing else is coming to mind, you can always put the poem away, look at it later, ask some friends to look at it, give it some more thought. But at some point you say, perfect is the enemy of good enough, right? I mean, we're not here to torture our poems or ourselves. We're here to create things and have a good time at it. So if life feels short and this is the best you can do, you go with it. But sometimes a poem is fully complete. It's in delicate balance. It doesn't need anything else. And a title might tip it over or subtract interest. That can happen. So if that's where your poem is, that's a really good reason to stay with the first line as a title. Sometimes people capitalize the words in the title, often not. That not capitalizing indicates it's going to roll straight into the next line of the poem. So I have a poem about a gathering in a friend's yard after he had died. So it's basically a wake. And sometimes I call the poem On Sasser Street, but there's really nothing in the poem to indicate Sasser Street or illustrate Sasser Street, except the fact that yards and houses tend to be adjacent to streets. That's not much of a reason to have it. And sometimes I call it by its first line, will you think it beautiful? So the title becomes, will you think it beautiful? And then the first line becomes, if I tell you about this afternoon. And to me, every time I look at this poem, I think delicate balance here, delicate balance. And so I've decided to leave the first line as the title. So that is one of your options. So those one-word titles we talked about at the beginning, Tony Hoagland's Lucky. You know, one word is not going to tell people much. And I mean, if it's a really dramatic word, it might be enough of a draw, but mostly those are the kind of titles we look past to see what's really going to happen with the poem. So to me, when a title is only one word, that may mean that the poem needs to kind of gather force quickly, i.e. get really interesting quickly in order to hold readers' attention. So Lucky, Tony Hoagland, that doesn't do much for me. We're going to look at his opening lines and you'll see how smart they are. And it does actually work, but right there, it doesn't say much. Indigo, Ellen Bass, that's actually a beautiful word to me. So that's kind of a draw. Biseidu, it's an intriguing title because we don't know what it means. It turns out it's a made-up word in the poem, but it's a beautiful poem. But right at that point, we have a word that's either in a language I don't know or, as it turns out, made up. Titles can also be super long for effect. The advantage of that is that it helps us begin to hear the voice of the speaker or to get the tone of the poem. So, A Lesson in Mercy from My Wife on the Last Day of May, that answers 3 of the 4 W's. It's got what, who, and when, and it just grounds us really effectively, much more than if you just said a lesson from my wife. You know, so we're already starting out, we're grounded. This is why people burning down fast food joints and whatnot, there's a voice starting there. The way that's phrased, there's a voice starting. And here's a voice, a collection of dangerous things interspersed with things occasionally fine or good. That's a different voice. It sounds a little formal. And I'm curious, that notion of fine or good. I'm curious what's going to happen here. And then we get to Barbara Hamby's odes. Barbara Hamby loves to write odes, and they are really kitchen sink poems. She throws everything in there, big long lines, lots of stuff, lots going on. So she'll end up with a title like Ode to Anglo-Saxon Film Noir and the 100,000 Anxieties That Plague Me Like Demons in a Medieval Christian Allegory. Well, there you go, right? We know lots of clues what might go on in that poem, and yet we really don't. I mean, really, I don't quite have an idea. Gosh only knows where she's going to go. But she's got our attention. It's humorous. It's busy. It's big. It's got a lot of real estate up there in that title. So the more I worked on this workshop, the more I came to believe that saying more in the title is really worthwhile. Those poems I have that have one-word titles, if they haven't already been published somewhere, I'm going to go back and look at them again, because I think, it is such a beautiful piece of real estate up there. And I really do want to use it. Sometimes the title becomes a refrain in the poem, like Jane Kenyon's really famous poem, Let Evening Come. She uses that phrase 4 times in the body of the poem, and she uses the word let several times. There's this music that happens when the title serves as a refrain. It's an opportunity to make the sound of your poem beautiful, unless in her poem, you may be saying something really like mutilated world over and over, and then maybe it's a different feeling you're creating, a different music, a discordant music, but it's still music. So a title can be used as a word or phrase from the poem. So that used to be a lot more popular when I first started writing, 15 years ago or so. And then it started getting dissed in some circles. Like, if you have it in the title, why do you need it in the poem? Or if it's in the poem, why are you using it for the title? I just think that's crankiness and fads on people's parts. And I know some beautiful poems, like on the next, looking down, Wendell Berry's The Peace of Wild Things. I gave you that whole poem because it's short and so beautiful. Where this works really effectively to me is when the word or phrase takes on new and deeper meaning when you get to it in the body of the poem. So it adds, it grows, and then it's exciting to get to it, because now you see, oh, that's what it means. That's what it really means in this poem. So when despair for the world grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things. So this is a person who brings his fear to the wild world. And so the title grows by the time we get to that phrase in the body of the poem. If you start looking around, you'll see this technique used, and you can think about it. Did it expand? Did the title grow when you found it in the body of the poem? That's what makes them really effective and beautiful. Otherwise, maybe it is, a loss of real estate. You could have said something different in the title. And sometimes a poem doesn't get much power from its title. Sometimes what you have is the best you can do, in which case we do 2 things. Remember that perfect is the enemy of good enough. That's an important phrase in poetry. Perfect is the enemy of good enough. The other thing is to take the advice of William Stafford, and I'm quoting roughly here, when he said, when the writing isn't going well, lower your standards. That's the way to stay at your desk and keep trying. That's the important thing, is to keep going. So I had this poem called June. It's about the chase tree in my yard when it blooms, and it's moving. There are so many bumblebees swarming this thing. It actually is moving and vibrating, and you can hear it. And there's a line in there about the tree sexed up by bumblebees, a chance to make seed. You know, this is the tree's big moment. I looked at it. My sister looked at it, the poet, my sister, and my friend who's a poet looked at it. None of us could think of anything to pull out of there or to say. So I said June, because that's adding information. That's when this is happening. And then I thought, oh, come on, I can do better. And what I ended up with was late June. Yeah, so that's a smidge better, but it is more specific. And being specific in a title is useful. It gives us more information. And then that poem got picked up by Poetry East, and I've never gotten in that journal before. So it's just evidence that you sweat over your titles, work on them hard, and then let it go. Because it's what the whole poem is doing that's going to matter to people if they're reading it or considering it for publication. So you do a lot of work on them and then you let them go. So what about leaving a poem untitled? You know, sonnets are like that. Think about it. Have a reason. Have a great reason to do that, because otherwise it's missed opportunity. You know, you're not using that real estate. So have a great reason for that. And then it's a good idea. I am going to stop here. And we are going to take a 10-minute break. And then we'll come back and work on the second half of this workshop. I'm going to look at your questions while you're out, and I hope you have a nice little relaxing stretch. And I'll see you at 2:27. Hi, everyone. We'll see. Maybe it'll recognize this is a different half of the workshop and it'll calm itself down. We'll see. John asked in the chat, how do you think about when a title is distracting to those not in the know about a reference? Nothing, no particular titles pop to mind. I think about that question though in two ways. One is that we're probably not going to be able to write for everybody in the world. So we have to decide if we're getting feedback from people that the title is distracting, if you get a lot of that kind of feedback and you want your readers with you, you know, say you're critiquing your poem with people, then you might consider working on that title some. If there's information in the title, or if the subject of the title is not sort of generally familiar, then you can be excluding people, and that's probably not your intention. So I would think about, ask myself that, is this title leaving people out in a way I don't mean to? Because it may be that you need some of that information in the poem in order for people to be with you. But again, if it's, you know, if you've got 10 people looking at this poem and one of them says, I don't get the title, you have to start weighing things. If the poem is working great to you, this is those artistic choices. We are never going to please everybody. So if that's your goal, give it up and focus on, you know, finding a lot of people who like the poem and accepting that not everybody's going to resonate with it. He's the one person. Baba Yaga. Okay, so it's about Baba Yaga. There you go. Okay. Oh, video. Oh, video. Internets are just such a thing to me. You know, I live way out in the country and I have a MiFi, and that's, you just can't run out there. You just don't get enough signal to run a Zoom session. I can do a lot of things, but not talk a long time. So apparently here I can talk, but not have my picture on the whole time today. So let's look at ways to begin poems. So some general notes I made are that, you know, this is your second opportunity to start connecting with people, to get them interested in what you're saying, to hook readers, to be interesting. If your poem doesn't get interesting till the 6th or 7th line down, then you may want to think about what's going on in the first 5. You know, just, it's worth checking out. Because sometimes opening lines, it's not uncommon, especially in our early drafts, to bury the lead. To bury the lead, so-called. Thank you, Margaret, for that. I appreciate it. So burying your lead, that means, you know, what you really need, where your poem is really going starts a few lines down. Sometimes people refer to it as having an on-ramp, and maybe it got you started with the poem, but then you look at those opening lines and say, are these still a part of the poem? Are they still serving the poem? So we can establish a lot of interesting information in the opening lines. You know, for instance, if there's a man in your poem and you get to the end and then you say he's a redhead and he's 42 and he's chain smokes, and we didn't get any of that at the beginning. You know, I've got a guy and he's gray haired and he's 70, and, you know, and somebody else has a 23-year-old. So, you know how it is if you suddenly are surprised by a detail toward the end of the poem and you've already filled in your own vision. So opening lines are a chance to get people with you, to make sure that they're going to go with you, that you've got, you know, got them fully grounded. So I have lots of options, lots of categories for opening lines. And what I want to say about these numbered categories is that, you know, some of them, I mean, this was just me doing this. This isn't like it came from a list somewhere, or these are written in stone and they teach them at all the universities or whatever. I just kept looking at opening lines and saying, what is this one doing? What is this one doing? And I split some things out, like I separated narrative descriptive from narrative conversational. That was just for the purpose of this conversation we're having. A narrative poem is still a narrative poem, regardless of how it opens, for instance. But just, I decided there were lots of different ways, and that the more categories, that having more categories made it more clear. So that's why you have so many. So why write narrative poems? Why write narrative openings? Well, we have stories to tell, lots of stories to tell. We grow up on stories. We grow up in stories. They're part of being human. And tell me a story is probably one of the oldest sentences in any language ever invented. Tell me a story. People love to read stories or hear them told. So that's why when we start in on a narrative opening, if it's structured well, if the words are interesting, it's one of the easiest ways on earth to connect with readers, because tell me a story. Tell me a story. So I was looking at Natasha Trethewey's history lesson. I am 4 in this photograph, standing on a wide strip of Mississippi beach, my hands on the flowered hips of a bright bikini. That's about as straightforward a narrative as you'll find. A first-person speaker describing a photograph. The opening line establishes the speaker, the photograph, and in the second line, the Mississippi beach. So 2 locations, Mississippi and beach. We're very well grounded. And then we have this cute image of flowered hips and a bright bikini and a little 4-year-old, So we've already got a picture of this photograph. I don't feel just like bowled over by that as an opening. It's just, but it's interesting. I'm interested. I'm going to stay in this poem. It's not one of those reach out and grab you and shake you kind of openings. But if you like 4-year-olds in little cute bikinis, you're gonna hang in there. The next one, Danusha Lamaris, Bonfire Opera. In those days, there was a woman in our circle who was known not only for her beauty, but for taking off all her clothes and singing opera. So that's your opening. You've got a character who strips and sings opera. And what I love, and that's a hook, because we're curious. And one of the things humans are curious about is nudity. I mean, let's be honest. But also, there's this old-fashioned storytelling opening in those days. That's almost a signal to sit back around the bonfire and start listening, right? I mean, it's just, there's going to be a story here. Settle back and listen. I'm about to tell you a story. So if you want that kind of slow-paced invitation, it's an invitation to start listening. The next poem here, Danusha Lamaris, Omens. Out here, we read everything as a sign. We don't know where out here is, but we know it's someplace out. And then what she does then, she shifts from that narrative opening line into images, a series of images. The coyote in its scruff coat, the mess of crows that fills the apple trees. She just shifts. We're not stuck in one style or another. She's using both image, incomplete sentences, phrases, images, and complete sentences. I'm going to skip down to Joy Harjo and Bird. The moon plays horn, leaning on the shoulder of the dark universe to the infinite glitter of chance. Tonight, I watch Bird kill himself, larger than real life. The opening is both narrative. That's a good question, Sam. I'll talk about it. Yeah, the opening is both narrative and metaphorical. Just because we're in narrative, we're not obligated to stay with concrete images. We can move between concrete and metaphorical as much as we want to. not all stories, keep in mind, not all stories are grounded in reality. You can go really fantastical and still be telling a narrative poem. So lots of metaphors here. The moon playing, that's a fantastical image, the moon playing horn. It's leaning on the shoulder of the dark universe, a metaphor of a universe having a shoulder, the infinite glitter of chance. And I watched Bird kill himself. That's a metaphor too. Bird being, see, this is one of those titles. You may know who she's talking about. You may know what she's talking about, or you might not. Bird is Charlie Parker. He's a jazz saxophone player. If you don't know that, it's going to take you a while to catch on to this poem, but you'll get it eventually that this is about a person. And of course, he didn't really kill himself. He was just playing his heart out, to use a cliche. So one of those titles where, do I want to take more people with me, or do I want to let them come along in the narrative of the poem and discover? So Sam, your question, I'm just going to grab it while we're right here. Should we strive to create narrative poems in the first person? There are no rules here. As far as I'm concerned, I would never say you should do one or the other. Honestly, I personally am not that comfortable writing in first person. Especially if it's in the past, especially long past, for me, that almost feels like a different person. So I'll use second person. I'll say you. I don't find myself ever saying she. I think the material would have to be super sort of radioactive for me to go to third person, but I do go to second. So I think that's strictly a matter of preference. And I like reading things in second person. My argument for second person is that I think it's a little easier for me, at least when I read a second person poem, to feel included. When somebody stays in first person, I'm being asked to observe. I'm being asked to look at the speaker. And then if it's a really super great poem, I'm glad I did. But if it only stays about the speaker and it doesn't go places or anything, it's like, well, it's like I wasn't that interested in you, as it turns out. But that's a strictly preference. A friend with psychosis uses third person because of their dissociation. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I'd say do what feels right for the poem. And you may find yourself also moving between first and second and third. When I wrote my chapbook, Wild Horses, it was about my best friend from high school and junior high, and then her death years later. And when I was writing the poems, it was a lot of we and I. And then once she died, I noticed I shifted to second person for a lot of those poems. Just couldn't go there with I. Just couldn't get that close. Just couldn't get that close to how hard that was. So that's, preference and choices. I was looking at Patty Ann Rogers' Hummingbird, a Seduction. If you don't know Patty Ann Rogers' work, she's brilliant, she's original, she's creative, she writes gorgeous, a lot of them nature poems. And this Hummingbird, a Seduction, if you look at it, it's line after line after line. If I were a female hummingbird perched still and quiet on an upper myrtle branch in the spring afternoon, lots of detail right there in that first line. We get female hummingbird, perched still and quiet, where the bird is, the upper myrtle branch, spring afternoon. And if you were a male, she goes on and on and on with if. All I gave you plus 9 more lines. And it's an if-then sentence. It's an if-then sentence. If this, then this. But she just keeps giving us more and more images. She looks at it from as many ways as she can before she goes to, then when you came down to see me, I would call you my own spinning bloom of ruby sage. So what she's done is keep us in suspense with her opening. And that's a great technique. You keep people hanging. They want to know where this is going. And you don't have to deliver that right away. That can, if you have more to say, keep saying it. It's beautifully written. It's interesting. It's very detailed. Lots and lots of nature images, and it's fun. So if that's another option for you, it's still narrative. but it's just an if-then sentence taken to its extreme. So like I said, I separated narrative openings from narrative conversational openings. The difference to me is that a conversational opening, we feel more spoken to, more directly spoken to. Or we can tell the narrator is speaking to someone else. We can tell who, hang on, is to shorten it a part of the poem. No, sorry. That was me. That was me shortening this to an if-then sentence. She's looking at Patty Ann Rogers' Hummingbird poem still. To shorten it, if I were a female hummingbird, the first line, then when you came down to me. No, I was just, sorry, I was trying to make that clear what was going on and I made it less clear. Sorry. So when a conversational opening, we feel spoken to, or we can see someone is being spoken to, it may not be us. And if somebody else is spoken to, we can be nosy. You know, it's that eavesdropping thing that humans like to do. We can follow along. So narrative conversational is a great style for, it's a nice style to me, it feels like something you can fall into. Like you're chatting with someone, like you're talking to someone. We're very good at talking to people. So if you can talk to people, you can just fall into a poem that way. It's kind of relaxing. So that first one, A Stand of Cottonwood, Carl Dennis. I'm glad to be here amid these cottonwood trees, feeling the wind from the lake on my face, sniffing the marsh smells and lake smells as I listen to the calls of unseen birds. And I'm glad as well. I feel spoken to. This is still a narrative poem, but there's something about this that feels a little more like I'm standing next to him almost. He's chatting. It's this simple, friendly tone that he takes that makes us feel spoken to. My sister Rebecca has a poem called Testimony for My Daughters. So an epigraph that says for my daughters. I included this partly because if you ever want to write a poem that ends up with long legs, go and look at this one. She wrote it in the 80s when the girls were little, and it's been published and republished, anthologized many times. People grab it out on the internet and put it on their blogs and their websites. So just recommend you go and look at it. Testimony for my daughters. I want to tell you that the world is still beautiful. I tell you that despite children raped on city streets, shot down in schoolrooms, despite the slow poison seeping from old and hidden sins into our air, soil, water. So it's conversational and it's directed to her daughters, and it's things she wouldn't have actually said to those tiny little girls when she wrote the poem. We're not the people being spoken to, but we're listening in. So the narrative conversational can be used like this to address difficult topics without writing right at them. You're still speaking to someone. The speaker here refers to children raped on city streets and all these other horrors, but she's not describing them in graphic detail. So we can use the narrative conversational to write apologies, confessions, hopes, frustrations. You might say in who the poem is for, either in the epigraph or the body of the poem. You might want to do that. It might be helpful to readers, but as with anything in poetry, it's an option, not a rule. Let's look down to Cicely Park's Vessel. Little canoe, you predict paddling, rapids and pockets of still water. The river bends for you along swallow perforated sandstone, past the cow skull flush with lupin, trembling. This is a poem spoken to an object, the canoe. It creates a relationship between the speaker and object. If the speaker were cursing the object, that would still be a relationship. It would just not be an affectionate sounding one like this. So writing to an object can be a really effective way to explore your world. So you could speak to your car, your coffee pot, a rock you're sitting on in the river. It's a nice way to explore. Sorry, pause for a sip here. And I included a separate section for what I think of as lyric conversational images. So a lyric poem from the Academy of American Poets, a short poem often with song-like qualities that expresses the speaker's personal emotions and feelings. So Kimberly Blazer, What I Believe, epigraph after Mike Blumenthal. I believe the weave of cotton will support my father's knees, but no indulgences will change hands. I believe nothing folds easily, but that time will crease, retrain the mind. I believe in the arrowheads of words, and I believe in silence. This poem is a declaration. We don't really know who the speaker is speaking to. It could just be writing to her computer screen or the page, the mirror, the air, or she's speaking to all of us. We can't say who she's speaking to exactly, but she's telling us about her world. Oh, great cat. The opening line echoes the title. And of course, you can see that refrain of I believe, I believe, I believe. It's written as if the speaker's answering a question, and it's not particularly narrative, right? It's written mostly in images. And of course, poems don't necessarily fit into neat categories. They can be hybrids of narrative and lyric. They can be a mix of concrete images and metaphorical ones, thoughts and feelings. All these things can end up in a poem. Paul Monette, here. Everything extraneous has burned away. This is how burning feels in the fall of the final year, not like leaves in a blue October, but as if the skin were a paper lantern full of trapped moths beating their fired wings. And yet I can lie on this hill just above you, a foot beside where I will soon lie myself. Soon, soon. And for all the rack and blubber, feel still how we were warriors. Paul wrote this as an elegy to his partner, Roger, who died of HIV a few years before Paul himself did. And it begins in image, everything extraneous burned away, the paper lantern, trapped moths beating their fired wings, and then it begins a narrative. And yet I can lie on this hill just above you, a foot beside where I will lie myself soon. We often write this way. We often write this way. And there's no, it depends poem to poem, whether you're going to begin in image or begin in narrative. That's just a decision your poem is going to make. You don't have to sit there and ponder that out, probably. You know, things come out the way they come out. Conversational poems can begin at the beginning, or they can begin in the middle of the action, which is sometimes indicated by an opening conjunction. And the cool thing about that is the technique, an advantage, you know, for is that we feel like we're already in the story. You know, it's like if it begins in and, but, so we're in the story. We feel already included, even though we don't know what the story is. It's a neat trick. Seamus Heaney's Postscript, one of the most beautiful poems I've ever seen. And sometime make the time to drive out west into County Clare along the flaggy shore. He tells us it's a postscript, which implies a PS on a letter. And then he just begins, and sometime. It's spoken to somebody who remains off stage, but the PS, the postscript is a really effective way to start mid-conversation. It's a command again, yeah. And sometime make the time, yes. Stephen Dunn's And So, it seems like a conversation the speaker is having with himself. And so you call your best friend who's away just to hear his voice. Matthew Oldsman, Mountain Dew commercial disguised as a love poem. This is a really great, hilarious poem. So here's what I've got. The reasons why our marriage might work. It just launches, right? That just sounds like, so here's what I've got. It's spoken to a specific person. It's the speaker's partner or spouse or future spouse. And it's definitely mid-conversation. So conversational beginnings, number 6, hopefully on your handout. Conversational beginnings can literally include conversation. You know, again, where humans are nosy, and getting to eavesdrop on somebody's conversation can be a treat. You know, we get hooked or we get repelled, but that can actually be a greater hook. You know, don't discard that idea. If it starts in conversation that's not appealing, that might be an even greater hook. We want to know. So Stephanie Pruitt, Mississippi Gardens, slaves, she answers, as I sink my fingers beneath the roots. It begins with what is the answer to a question, but we don't know what the question was yet. So then we're going to be curious and keep going. Definitely read this poem. It's brilliant. Or the Satanist next door. Oh my gosh, the whole poem is this back and forth conversation between two people about who are in their bed about what might be going on in the house next door. And it's kind of repelling, you know, it's sort of like, oh, but it's also interesting. And so we stay in it the whole time because we're really curious what's going to happen. But it's just back and forth dialogue. And it takes a minute to figure out, oh, this is two people going back and forth. What is that? Is that a kid? Is that Tom? No, it's her. Ooh, I think that's a whip. No, it's a hand coming down hard. No, listen, there's a wind-like sound to it. There's like a wind sound to it. It's just this back and forth humor exchange, as if they're listening in on the neighbors. So another way to speak to people conversationally is the epistolary poem or letter poem. Some writers and some teachers consider any poem of direct address, like the ones we've just been looking at, to be epistolary. But I separated out letter poems because there are things that are definitely letter poems. Like Matthew Oldsman tells us in a title, this is a letter to someone living 50 years from now. He tells us right away it's a letter. Susan Lauder Myers had the most the book is still in the world. My Dear, Dear Staggergrass, such an imaginative book. It's written in letters. And letters to things, non-human creatures, things, events. If you're ever stuck for how to begin a poem, writing it as a letter is just this great way to open up to what wants to be said. Just start writing a letter. Dear heavy traffic. You can write to the traffic. You can write to anything. Sharon Olds' poem, Ode to Dirt. Dear Dirt, I am sorry I slighted you. And sometimes that's what letters are for. They're apologies, right? So if you have something you want to apologize for, it doesn't have to be to a person, but it could be. Writing it as a letter is a good way to get yourself started. You know, you may not keep that in revision. There might be a reason to discard the sort of letter effect of it, but it's a great way to get going. And, you know, as you can see, people publish letter poems that are really effective. Checking the chat. Yeah, okay, we're okay. So what about interrogative or inquisitive beginnings? You know, beginnings that ask a question. The advantage of that is that asking a question gives us a great opportunity to explore it. Notice I didn't say answer it. You know, it's not the job of a poem necessarily to answer every question. That may be what the poem wants to do, or it may end having left the question open. So a great way to jumpstart poems is to think about what you have questions about. What do you want to know? So if you're ever wanting to write but don't have an idea, what do you want to know? What do you have a question about? And start exploring that way. May Swenson's poem Question is quite well known. Body, my house, my horse, my hound, what will I do when you are fallen? It's a poem about death. And asking it all is a question because we don't have answers about what happens after death. Walt Whitman opened his poem Miracles. Why? Who makes much of a miracle? As to me, I know of nothing else but miracles. What a gorgeous reversal. You know, what a gorgeous reversal. Everything is a miracle to this guy. But he starts out by saying, who makes much of a miracle? They're kind of like they're laying around everywhere. So let's look at image-based beginnings, number 9. These could also be called lyric openings because they begin an image and not narrative, though of course they might move into the narrative. Images can be vivid, they can be visceral. They're asking us to see, hear, smell, touch, taste something by offering it stripped of any narrative. That puts us into our senses and not in our reasoning brain. It's awakening, we're engaged. If I were to say in a poem, if you read the line, sour tang of lemon on the tongue, it's possible that you're going to start to experience lemon a little bit because we know what lemon is. And I didn't put that in a lot of narrative. I just handed it right there. You might just shorten that even. You could shorten that. And it's a vivid, visceral experience. So let's look at Jack Gilbert, A Brief for the Defense. Sorrow everywhere, slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving somewhere else with flies in their nostrils. But we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. Otherwise, the mornings before summer dawn would not be made so fine. What an incredible and complicated opening. We can't picture sorrow everywhere. That's amorphous. We have a sense of, what he's telling us, it's just pervasive. Slaughter is much more visceral. We probably recoil from that word. Slaughter everywhere. If babies are not starving someplace, they are starving someplace else, period. And then wanting us to really see this phrase, with flies in their nostrils. Oh my gosh. We're moved. This hits you in the gut, right? We're moved into grief and compassion, into our emotions. They're painful emotions. So we kind of read on hoping for some relief. And then we get this image of we enjoy our lives because that's what God wants. So he's given us this. Then he introduces the notion of a creator. You've got suffering juxtaposed with enjoyment. He's suddenly created a really complex situation. And we're going to read that to hopefully see some resolution. You don't necessarily get that, but that's probably what we want. But, the writer's obligation isn't to make things nice and sweet and easy for us, right? But this is a brilliant poem. This is one we're going to look at in the second half of this workshop in February, because it's just too amazing not to. Let's look at Kim Adenizio, High Desert, New Mexico. She's got a solidly grounded, that's the place. She gave us 2 places, High Desert plus the deserts in New Mexico. So she wants us to be in that area, feeling it already. But then what does she give us? Temple of the rattlesnake's religion, deluge and heat surge, crutch of the atom's rupture. These 3 amazing images. The temple, she didn't just say sand, she's called it the temple and the rattlesnake's religion. Deluge and heat surge, crutch of the atom's rupture. Yeah, where the atom bomb was first tested, or one of the places it was first tested. Images let us move quickly, the way Adenizio does here. We can condense and intensify things. So if you have a poem that feels wordy in some way, or in some way it feels wordy, or in some way it isn't working, try stripping it back to its images and see what you have. Is it more exciting? Is that more interesting? Are there places you need to add a little narrative back in? That's a way to revise, to try it in a different format. So if you're adding back in, can you make those words really vivid so they earn their place? Let's talk about musical beginnings, number 9. Their musical beginnings can be narrative or lyric in their opening lines, but what's especially attractive about them to me is their music. So you'll notice a lot of these poems, these openings I've given you, they could fit in several categories. I was picking and choosing because I think music in opening lines is really appealing to me. When an opening line it sings in some way, the sounds are really beautiful. That to me is a poem I'm going to keep going with. And it's also possible, there's this thing I think of as flow. If the sound is flowing, if you're using alliteration, for instance, or slant rhyme or something like that, it kind of pulls readers along. It pulls me along because I feel like I've stepped into a river and I'm being taken along. So I love it when people really pay attention to their music in their poems. And we grow up with music. In our culture, it's all around us. We hear music all the time. So when a written line reads musically, echoing consonants or vowels, slant rhyme, direct rhyme, a strong beat works, we're already conditioned to slip into the song, so to speak. We're already built for that. And if you write musically, it might be obvious to readers, or it might be that the music is subtle. But either way, it pleases something in people. Unless you're deliberately creating jarring music, and which you certainly might if that serves the poem, that might not be pleasing. It might be deliberately jarring, but that might be what you need to do for that poem. So even a simple line, something as simple as Stephen Dobbins' How to Like It. These are the first days of fall. That's just beautifully musical to me. He's got first and fall. He's got 2 words starting with the same consonant. He's got that beat. These are the first days of fall. I like that beat. And, when you put short one syllable words together, you tend to get good, solid downbeat. First days. And that just adds something. William Wright once said in a workshop, 3 short words together have a lot of power. And it's the power of the sound that he's talking about. So, of course, this is a narrative beginning. It's a narrative poem. Let's look at Dennis Smith, the 17-year-old and the gay bar. This gin-heavy heaven, blessed ground to think gay and mean we. Bless the fake ID and the bouncer who knew this need to be needed, to belong, to know how a man tastes full on vodka and free of sin. Lots and lots of music there, lots of sound. Heavy heaven. He used blessed and bless. He's got we, fake ID, this need to be needed, free of sin. It's musical. It's musical. That's why we're part of what he's creating is something we can listen to. Patricia Smith, black poured directly into the wound. If you don't know Patricia Smith and you want to study originality, fresh language, and musicality, definitely read her work. I saw her in a workshop once. I have her on such a pedestal. I thought all this came easily to her for some reason. And then I saw her in a workshop and she said, if I've heard it before, I take it out. I stay at my desk, no cliches, nothing is in my poem is going to be staying in my poem if I've read it like that someplace else. So she just stays at her desk longer. It was fascinating to learn that. But she definitely has a way with language. Prairie winds blaze through her tumbled belly, and Emmett's read yesterdays refused to rename her any kind of mother. So we have blaze and belly, we have red and yesterdays and refuse and rename and her and mother, all these sound echoes. I like to think of it as sound echoes. You don't have to learn assonance, consonants, alliteration. You don't have to learn all those words. Just think of it as echoes. If you hear echoes of sound, How can you use those to make your poem more musical? Laura Newton, Bird Canticle. Let there be multitudes of birds. Let them fan the small campfire of our sleep. Like Carolina wrens nest in the empty guitar cases. It's musical to hear something repeated over and over. Like Jane Canyon's Let Evening Come. It's kind of incantatory, right? And it uses this thing called anaphora, which means repetition of the first word of a line. You don't need that word, but it keeps using let over and over and over to create this kind of incantation. So instructional poems or didactic. Didactic has a specific definition that I think I included. But instructional poems, what do you know how to do? What do you want to tell people? What do you want to see changed, maybe? What do you feel passionate about? These are just a few of the reasons to write instructional poems. Another reason is that if the material is really hot, if it's painful, writing something as a series of instructions allows you to step back out of your emotions and into your prefrontal cortex a little bit, up into your reasoning brain. So you're ordering things. You're thinking about how to say this in an order. You go to what's called curious observer. So this is what that's like. And you write from there, you describe. So a poem might be titled How to Bake a Cake or How to Jump Out of an Airplane. And it's actually also about how to get through a divorce or a death. I did read a poem like that once. I couldn't find it anywhere. It was something like How to Operate a Bandsaw. And it had divorce in the poem. So that's one possibility. So let's just look at a couple of these. Dorian Locke's Anti-Lamentation. I love that word, anti-lamentation. She just made that up, but it's a great word. Regret nothing. Right there, the instruction comes right at the beginning. Regret nothing. Not the cruel novels you read to the end just to find out who killed the cook. Not the insipid movies that made you cry in the dark. See, she just goes, regret nothing, and then begins a list of things to not regret. The poem does do other things. It goes other places. It's excellent. But it's a simple command. You might have something you want to say to people, like you might even start with the word stop. I want to tell my neighbors lately, stop. They keep burning green wood or something and it smokes up the whole neighborhood all day long. And I just want to say, stop, you're polluting the world, quit this. And that might be how I would start a poem to them. I might write a letter poem to them and say, dear neighbors, stop. It's in my mind anyway. So here is W.S. Merwin correctly done. The poem title is Thanks, and the first word is listen. With the night falling, we are saying thank you. He did that deliberately. That isn't a typo. He put the word listen all by itself on the line to give us an instruction. He really wanted us to pay attention. Listen. Mary Oliver, Wild Geese, quite a famous poem. So the title is Wild Geese, and the geese do appear toward the end of the poem. But what we get in the first few lines, you do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. So it's an instructional poem that begins in the negative. You do not have to do this. You don't have to do this. You could write an instructional poem that's like, this is not how you do this. You could do that. You have that option. Adam Zagajewski, Try to Praise the Mutilated World. He repeats that phrase several times in the poem. And, he keeps reminding us, he gives us beautiful things. Try to praise the mutilated world. Remember June's long days and wild strawberries, drops of rosé wine, the nettles that methodically overgrow the abandoned homesteads of exiles. You must praise the mutilated world. He gives us that phrase in different ways over and over throughout this poem, but it's an instructional poem. He's saying, try to praise this world, even though it's a mess. If you're writing environmental poems, this is a really good one to look at right now. I mean, if you're writing climate change poems, this would be a good one to get some ideas from. I have a poem that I wrote about I've written a lot of poems. She's been my flood subject. She was my flood subject for quite a few years, my mom and her dementia. I have a poem called Instructions for Caring. Lie often. When she thinks your sister Pauline, talk about growing up on the family farm. So this poem is a series of instructions about lying. If she refuses cough medicine, lay a hand on her chest to show her where the sickness is. Speak as her mother, call her Lillian. If you've had something you've gone through, if you've gone through something and you've come out the other side and learned some things, that might be another reason to write an instructional poem and start right up front. Lie often. I mean, I didn't add a lot of extra words. I just said as small and as blunt and as clear. And I think that's, like Dorian Locke's regret nothing, like W.S. Merwin, listen. It's a strong way to open. Just give this direct instruction to somebody. Oh, here's one of my favorite topics here. Openings that reverse the expectations created by the title, number 11. Ellen Bass's poem, Relax. Bad things are going to happen. Your tomatoes will grow a fungus and your cat will get run over. Someone will leave the bag with the ice cream melting in the car and throw your blue cashmere sweater in the dryer. Your husband will sleep with a girl your daughter's age, her breasts spilling out of her blouse. Okay, so blunt opening line, bad things are going to happen. And look what an effective reversal of the title. She's got us hooked, right? First, we're told to relax. Then we're immediately told bad things are going to happen, which in most of us evokes the opposite feeling from relaxed, right? And then she starts naming bad things. And they aren't exotic. They aren't things that never will happen. They're kind of realistic stuff that does happen. So she's got us. Now she's got to show us why we should relax. So very effective hook, very effective in getting people to keep reading. And she has another poem, What Did I Love? And then the first line is, what did I love about killing the chickens? Oh, it's sort of like being sucker punched. What did I love? And, bye, Maya, thank you. What did I love? And we're thinking, oh, what did I love in the past? Oh, that boy, oh, that place I lived, all these places this poem could go. And then she's talking about what did I love about killing the chickens? If you want to learn to write bluntly and honestly and graphically, read this poem because you're going to hear viscera in this poem. But again, it's like, you're going to have to explain this because what would anybody love about killing chickens? It's just kind of a gross mess. I mean, I've done it. It's not fun. So echoing the title in your opening line and then immediately reversing what's going on with that opening line is a really fun way to play. And here's Tony Hoagland's Lucky. If you are lucky in this life, you will get to help your enemy the way I got to help my mother when she was weakened past the point of saying no. What an amazing reversal of expectation, right? This is what I meant about a one-word title being vague. We don't know where it's going, but it leaves the writer all the room in the world to go somewhere. And I said, if you're going to use a one-word vague title, you might want to, get some interest going really fast. Well, this kicked the door open. If you're lucky, you'll get to help your enemy. We don't usually think of that as luck, right? I mean, why is that lucky? And then this surprise second reversal, the way I got to help my mother. So we're 3 lines in and he's already spun our heads twice. That's really good, effective writing. And he set up this conflict of expectations. Now she's his enemy, but he's helping her. What is going to happen here? We're going to keep reading to figure this out. Beautiful poem, by the way. If you're a caregiver for anybody, it's like really beautiful read. So like I said, though, one-word titles are often vague and not that great, not that interesting. So get out of the gate fast if you can, so that the interest comes early. Compare lucky, for instance, to something like, I found $1 million in a Bible tract on the sidewalk. That's lucky, right? And that's not a real title, by the way, but think of the potential conflict between the luck of finding the money and the immediate reminder of potential moral responsibilities. If I was choosing between these two titles, I would read the $1 Million poem first. So just a pitch for, keep thinking about those titles. Barbara Hamby's Ode to Forgetting the Year. And then she goes on to tell us all these terrible things that happen that you want to forget. That's a pretty immediate reversal. In fact, it happens right away in the title, because odes are by definition praise poems. So this is a praise poem to forgetting your worst moments. Crystal Wilkinson, Asking About My Mother. In the small kitchen, the hogshead weaves the gamey scent of death throughout the house. Wow. That is one heck of an opening line. Didn't expect that. And then the grandmother scraping the hair and all that. I ask her about my mother. I always ask her about my mother. Well, she's asking about her mother, and then there's a hogshead and the gamey scent of death. It's clear right away the mother's dead. You wouldn't kind of go there probably if she wasn't. But just an amazing, startling, even it's kind of a grotesque image, and not what we expect from the title. So in a similar vein, there are blunt opening lines that surprise or even shock, and you could definitely shove Crystal Wilkinson's poem about her asking about her mother into that category. But what about Maxine Cuman and Woodchucks? The title is Woodchucks. I'm thinking, oh, and she goes, gassing the woodchucks didn't turn out right. Oh my gosh. So maybe we were expecting a nice little nature poem about woodchucks, or maybe at least a little mercy. It's this blunt poem that just goes for it. Gabrielle Calvo Caresi, Hammond B3 Organ Cistern. We talked about that title. Opening lines, the days I don't want to kill myself are amazing. I don't know about you, but I saw the Hammond B3 and I jumped into this poem. This is a case of, I think John was asking about references other people don't necessarily get. The Hammond B3 is a keyboard. I'm sure lots of people play it, but it's been around forever. People are still playing it. But, I grew up in the 70s. I was a teenager in the 70s, and rock and roll musicians played this. Greg Allman, Billy Preston, Ray Manzarek of the Doors, Steve Winwood, James Brown. All these people played it. So I see Hammond B3 and I jump with both feet into this poem. And then I get this, the days I don't want to kill myself are amazing. I completely ignored that word cistern. I said, okay, whatever, and just kept going. And, it's a big slap, but it's effective. Shock is an effective tool for getting people's attention. I wouldn't want to do it myself with every poem. I think that would get relentless, but Jericho Brown, similarly, bullet points. I will not shoot myself in the head, and I will not shoot myself in the back, and I will not hang myself with a trash bag. And if I do, I promise you, I will not do it in a police car while handcuffed. This is how stupid our world is, that a man would feel like he needed to write this poem, but he just put it in print. And of course, the phrase bullet points refers to a list of items, and that's what we get. But oh my God, who would expect this? So beginning with an epigraph, number 13. So epigraphs evolved because there was a newly burgeoning reading middle class, and the writers were not used to writing to the middle class who weren't educated in the classics. So they would use quotes from the classics to tune people into what they were writing about. But now epigraphs come from anywhere, from literature, other poems, from the Bible, from the Quran, from news articles, from headlines, from quotes of something somebody said. We can also attribute a poem with an epigraph to a certain person, you know, like my sister did, testimony for my daughters. Sometimes a quote is the way we start a poem. You know, that's what starts the inspiration, and you use it as an epigraph. And then, of course, as the poem develops in revision, you ask yourself whether the epigraph is still serving the poem. I've had epigraphs before that ended up leaving because I didn't need them anymore by the time I was done writing. But they're a great way to jumpstart poems. If you want something to write, look around for interesting quotes. You can think of a topic you're interested in and look for quotes on that subject. The internet is great for that. Like Poems of Witness, I worked with some of those that way. It's also possible to add an epigraph to a poem in progress if something wonderful presents itself, or if the poem isn't working all that well. It's an interesting way to shake it up and get new ideas. So they're handy for that. And of course, they're often short. Grace Schulman's American Solitude, The Cure for Loneliness is Solitude, Marianne Moore. We'll probably talk about this poem in the second workshop, but these opening lines, she starts with, Hopper never painted this. But here on the snaky path, his vision lingers. If you don't know who Edward Hopper is, you're not fully included in what's going on, because you don't get this sort of stark light kind of effect that Hopper used. But there's so much in this poem, you can still get a lot without knowing Hopper. So if you're going to make a reference to someone famous, people are probably going to come with you. A lot of people will come with you. If you're referring to someone obscure, like your next door neighbor is a fantastic painter, but they aren't famous, you might want to tell a little more so that people are with you. You know, this reference to Hopper works because he's so famous. But also remember that we write what we write. If what you're writing is so obscure that no one understands it, and you want that understanding, you may need to rethink your strategy. So your not so famous neighbor painter may need a little more information in the poem, maybe more clues. But keep in mind that if you try to guarantee that everyone on earth understands your poem, you're likely to drive yourself crazy. So that's not necessarily a goal of writing. Also, that it isn't a mark of genius if no one gets it. So let's look at a couple more of these epigraphs. Fatima Asghar, Pluto shits on the universe. That's on your next page, probably. I printed mine a little bigger so I could see it. So I'm not quite on the same page as you. So she gives us this really scientific explanation of what happened to Pluto being discredited from planet status. And then she gives us this fabulous voice of Pluto. So we've got the juxtaposition of science with, today I broke your solar system. Oops, my bad. Your graph said I was supposed to make a nice little loop around the sun. No. That sassy voice, it's such a stunning opening. So that's a juxtaposition you could create. Some very proper sounding epigraph, and then a voice that just doesn't carry that tone at all. And Alicia Ostraker, Daffodils. She uses 3 epigraphs. For David Lehman, that's an epigraph. She gives us Wordsworth's quote about daffodils. It's about daffodils. He doesn't say that, but 10,000 saw at a glance, tossing their heads in a sprightly dance. And then she gives us Jack Spicer. Going into hell so many times tears it, which explains poetry. It's really a bold and unusual move to use 3 epigraphs, or even 2. I don't know that I've ever seen that. So right away, she's created this tension. We have the juxtaposition of Wordsworth's sprightly dance of daffodils, and then Jack Spicer's references to hell and poetry. So we're kind of expecting the poem's going to reflect on all three of these subjects, and it does. Also, epigraphs can be used to indict. I thought that was an important category. I just kind of stuck that out there by itself. An opportunity to bear witness. Patricia Smith from Blood Dazzler, her poem Thankful. She has this quote from Barbara Bush, you know, about they all want to stay in Texas. Everyone is so overwhelmed by the hospitality. And so many of the people in the arena here, you know, were underprivileged anyway. So this chuckles slightly is working very well for them. Barbara Bush, this is during Hurricane Katrina. She was married to the President of the United States at the time, right? We know who she is. And then our mothers once crafted bouquets from chicken necks or that part of a hog's belly, whatever it was, that dragged low in its shit. They decorated mirrored shadow boxes with chipped porcelain nothing at alls, jelly glasses, or white dolls stunned in their gingham. She goes on to show us underprivileged in a big way. I mean, there's cockroaches in this poem, but she also shows us how this is home. These people lost their home. And Barbara Bush is totally discounting that. So if you have things you want to say, political things going on in the world, this is a great way to do that. An epigraph and a response. Oh my gosh, it's 3:29. That worked. I'm wondering if anybody has a question. I want to let people go on time also, but if you have a question and want to put it in the chat, or at this point, if you want to say it out loud, I could listen. But also, if you need to leave, I just want to say thank you for coming. I appreciate it. I hope the handout is something. Oh, thank you. The handout for part 2 will be posted early again. They'll do it exactly the same as they did last time. If you sign up for the second workshop, which is February 26th, on turns and endings, and we'll be looking at whole poems. So of course, we'll look at the title and the beginning and the turns and the endings. Oh, thank you, Angela. Oh, thanks. Yeah, so they'll do the same way. They'll do the same way they did this last time. If you sign up by that Thursday evening before the workshop on Sunday, they will send you a link to the handout and a link to the workshop. Oh, thanks, everybody.
Pam, I have a question. Can I say
Yeah,
it into the room?
And the rest of you need to go, please just go. And thank you so much for coming.
I don't, this will sound like I'm asking it specific to me, but I don't want to be that person. So I really mean it in sort of a seeking a strategy or a way of, I start my own poems, begin with what authentically interests you as language, a Stephen Dunnism. And because of that, the musical connective tissue of my poems is so tight that I can't, and I don't mean that like pat myself on the back. I just mean that it means I can't see anymore where I'm not entering the poem fast enough. I don't know how to see the global integrity of the poem or lack of integrity when I'm shaping so much via music.
I understand that because I have worked on poems before and taken them to critique. And I like the music so much that I get really upset if somebody tells me I need to look at a line that maybe this isn't working, because it breaks the music around it. So is the poem actually working just because the music is working? Is that sort of a rephrase of your question?
Not necessarily, Pam, but I'm cool if you answer that, because I of course I've lulled myself into thinking it is, but I'm getting feedback where the poem is falling short in multiple places. Mostly, I don't know. I don't know if you can answer this generally, but it's where I'm stuck.
Yeah.
Seeing my poems globally.
Yeah. Well, one way to deal with that is to take it apart, make a list off to the side of what each line is doing in the poem, what information it's communicating, and take the music out of those. just say it real plain. I've got this, it says this line says this. And then you'll see if people are telling you, I don't get it, there's not enough information, you know, something's missing, then you can look at it in a different way. And I've found that useful on occasion. I haven't used that technique all that often, but it does give you a chance to sort of break the poem down into what it's doing, as opposed to how it's doing it. So I think maybe separating those two things might help you. Does that sound useful?
That sounds so useful. Thank you so much for this workshop.
Oh, you're welcome. Sure. Sure. Anybody else have a question? Okay, well then thanks so much, everybody. I'm gonna see if I can turn my video on long enough to wave goodbye. Thanks so much for coming and staying. It was great. It was a fun time. And I think really the handout is the best part of this workshop, honestly. It's talking about it it's like it's getting to play with it. That's going to be the really interesting thing. So I hope you have a great time with it. And maybe I'll see some of you in February. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.